The trap of the imaginary resume operates as a psychological treadmill. Every memory, every milestone, and every glance at someone else's curated success becomes ammunition for self-judgment. The mind constructs a detailed, idealized timeline and internal resume of accomplishments that should have been earned by this point in life. Promotions, relationships, published works, financial milestones all are meticulously cataloged and compared against current reality. The calculation is relentless, automatic, and cruel. Every perceived shortfall generates a spike of shame, a gnawing sense that the self is lagging, underperforming, or fundamentally inadequate. What makes this pattern so insidious is that it masquerades as rational planning. The individual convinces themselves that the mind is simply evaluating progress, but in reality, the imaginary resume is a weaponized feedback loop designed by the ego to maintain a sense of urgency, inadequacy, and control. The more a person measures themselves against the fictional timeline, the more they reinforce the emotional intensity of shame. Unlike constructive reflection, this process is not forward-looking. It traps the individual in endless self-reinforcing cycles of existential anxiety. Consider a hypothetical 30-year-old professional. In their mind, they should have advanced to a managerial role by 28, acquired a house by 29, and published a book by 30. In reality, perhaps they are still in middle management, renting an apartment, and have only started drafting a manuscript. The gap between the real and the imagined timeline triggers intense self-recrimination. Their brain interprets this gap as failure, even though objectively they are progressing. The imaginary resume doesn't account for context economic factors, personal growth, unforeseen obstacles, instead applies a rigid, arbitrary standard to complex, messy life realities. This compulsion is reinforced by social comparison. The brain constantly scans for benchmarks, whether through peers, social media, or cultural narratives of achievement. Every highlight reel from friends, colleagues, or influencers becomes proof that the individual is behind schedule. The effect is magnified in the modern era of constant connectivity, where curated glimpses of others' lives flood the mind with selective success stories. The ego interprets these signals as objective truth. If they are not matching these timelines, they must be failing. The emotional mechanics of this process are rooted in anxiety, shame, and a subtle form of grief. The anxiety arises from the sense that life is slipping away, that time is finite, and that every unachieved milestone is a lost opportunity. Shame emerges because the ego evaluates these missed milestones as a reflection of personal inadequacy, rather than as a consequence of circumstance, randomness, or the natural variability of human growth. Grief is inherent in the unfulfilled vision of the self. The person mourns the version of themselves that exists only in the mind's constructed timeline. These emotions overlap and reinforce one another, creating a dense psychological trap. The trap of the imaginary resume also impedes action. The constant evaluation of what should have been achieved can generate paralysis. The mind becomes hyper-focused on past shortfalls or future projections, diverting attention and energy from the present. Decisions are delayed, projects are postponed, and opportunities are ignored because the ego is preoccupied with measuring performance against an impossible, idealized schedule. Instead of living or creating, the individual is stuck in a loop of internal audit, calculating, comparing, and condemning. Neurologically, this pattern is reinforced by the same reward circuits involved in perfectionism and compulsive planning. Every imagined accomplishment, achieving the goal on the internal resume, aids the brain's anticipation networks, releasing small bursts of dopamine. The brain briefly simulates success, creating a temporary sense of reward and motivation. When the imagined success is contrasted with reality, the resulting gap produces stress and cortisol release. Over time, the mind learns to oscillate between anticipation and anxiety, maintaining the cycle of obsessive comparison. Culturally, the imaginary resume is amplified by societal narratives. Modern culture emphasizes timelines, benchmarks, and measurable outcomes. Education systems, corporate ladders, and even social media reinforce linear progression. Finish school, start a career, marry, buy a house, achieve recognition. Deviations from these timelines are interpreted as abnormal, inadequate, or wrong. The individual internalizes these cultural scripts. converting societal expectations into personal metrics, and feels an unrelenting pressure to reconcile life's reality with an imaginary ideal. The psychological consequences extend beyond shame. Chronic engagement with the imaginary resume leads to existential dissatisfaction. The mind evaluates life not by lived experience, meaning, or intrinsic fulfillment, but by adherence to an arbitrary external metric. This results in persistent restlessness, irritability, and a sense that life is insufficient, regardless of tangible accomplishments. Even successes feel hollow if they do not match the imagined timeline. The trap ensures that the individual is perpetually chasing, perpetually unsatisfied, and perpetually aware of a lag between reality and expectation. A practical example is the aspiring writer who constantly calculates what they should have published by their current age. Each comparison with a peer or historical figure compounds shame. The person delays submitting manuscripts, avoids critique, or abandons projects prematurely because the ego fears confirming perceived inadequacy. The result is that time continues to pass, achievements remain unclaimed, and the psychological burden of the lost years grows heavier. The pattern is self-sustaining. The more one calculates, the more one avoids, and the more the years are experienced as lost. Breaking free from this trap requires awareness and intentional recalibration. The first step is recognizing that the imaginary resume is a constructed psychological artifact, not a factual measure of worth. Life does not adhere to a linear schedule, and human growth is inherently external metrics, cultural benchmarks, and social comparisons are helpful for orientation, not ultimate judgment. Accepting this truth is critical for reducing the emotional charge of the lost years. The next step involves mindfulness and reframing by focusing attention on present accomplishments, growth, and experiences. The individual can counteract the brain's compulsive comparison mechanism. Journaling, reflection, and gratitude practices help anchor self-worth in lived experience rather than imagined timelines. This approach shifts the internal metric from what should have been achieved to what has been experienced, learned, and contributed, fundamentally altering the emotional dynamics of shame and anxiety. Another strategy is to disrupt the cognitive loop through deliberate action. Rather than ruminating on missed milestones, the individual selects achievable, meaningful goals that are aligned with intrinsic values rather than the arbitrary imaginary resume. Action replaces calculation, engagement replaces rumination, and progress becomes a measure of authentic growth rather than a comparison to an impossible timeline. Over time, this rewiring reduces the compulsive shame-driven focus on the lost years and reclaims agency over the narrative of one's life. The trap of the imaginary resume is a deeply human struggle, but one that can be addressed through conscious awareness, reframing, and intentional action. Recognizing the artificiality of internal timelines, understanding the psychological mechanisms of shame and comparison, and cultivating a present-focused orientation are essential steps toward liberating the self from existential anxiety. The goal is not perfection, not adherence to an external standard, but reconciling past, present, and future in a way that affirms meaning, agency, and psychological health. If this resonates, like, comment, and subscribe to The Fictionist. The channel explores the hidden psychological structures that shape thought, behavior, and emotional experience, offering insight into why the mind manufactures existential shame, how patterns like the imaginary resume operate, and strategies for reclaiming agency and presence.